Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And today I get the chance to talk with two guests simultaneously, Luke Crane and Thor Olavsrud. Now, these two brilliant young men are behind a couple of tabletop role-playing games that I have recently discovered and that I think are absolutely phenomenal. You can find them on burningwheel.com. Now, that's the name of one of the games these two guys put together. Another game they put together is one called Torchbearer, as in those who bear torches into the dungeons. Another one is called Mouse Guard, based off the graphic novels Mouse Guard. This is the RPG. They've worked on these together, and they work on games separately. They work on more stuff together than just those two. So I get a chance to talk with them about the world of role-playing games, about monsters, about these kinds of stories that we tell, whether at the tabletop or in books or in films. And not only are these two gentlemen behind games like this, and award-winning games, by the way, Mouse Guard won Role-Playing Game of the Year when it came out. Not only are they behind these kinds of things, but they've got a ton of other projects going on too. For instance, Luke Crane is head of games at Kickstarter. And as I found out recently, that games are king at Kickstarter, and so he's an influential and powerful man there, although it doesn't sound like he would admit to being influential or powerful as much as somebody who deeply loves games, because he truly does. Thor Olavsrud is not only an editor and game designer and writer, but he's a journalist, and he's a senior writer over at CIO.com, a journalist specifically on data analytics, security, infrastructure. And not only that, but in case you're into roller derby, which I sometimes am, in addition to my other eclectic interests as well, but not as much as Thor, who is coach of at least a couple of roller derby teams up in New York City, Gotham Girls Roller Derby All-Stars. I think I've even seen them play around where I live. And Luke's into roller derby as well. They're into a bunch of really cool stuff, and I was really excited about the chance to talk to these guys because they've put some games together, like I say, I've only recently discovered, and they spun my head around. We're gonna get into some of those details a little bit and branch out. For those of you who are like, I don't know if I'm into role-playing games necessarily, should I continue with the episode? I think so, because we not only talk about the pragmatics of storytelling at the tabletop and how you make rules help people tell these kinds of stories and live out these awesome games. But I think we get into some cool philosophical directions too that'll satisfy any listener of this show. So here we go, my conversation with Luke Crane and Thor Olavsrud. One more time, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the Monster Professor, and I feel really honored and fortunate to get both of you at the same time, and so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
I wanted to give you an idea and the listeners an idea of why I'm so excited about talking to both of you. I had this weird kind of snaking, winding path to encountering a tabletop RPG called Torchbearer. And it was through a video game, oddly enough, and articles about that led me to Torchbearer. And that also led me to Mouse Guard, the role-playing game based on the comic books or the graphic novels. And those things absolutely spun my head around. Like, you guys ended up re-engineering everything I knew about tabletop RPGs. I come from Dungeons and Dragons world, and then
I really got into Steve Jackson's GURPS for a while, but then I kind of got out of it. And I've been out of playing games for at least 15 years, maybe 20 years. And so, but those role playing games kind of pushed me into writing. I guess primarily I'm a writer. And only now am I encountering Torchbearer and Mouse Guard, these RPGs. And that's lighting me back up. Like, you guys turn things around. I'll get more into it in a minute about what exactly I find so brilliant about what you've put together with those two games. But you also have Burning Wheel, and you have some setting supplements to Torchbearer like Mittermark. And I want to get into a little bit of that, but first I want to start at the start with you guys. Where did your fascination and love of role-playing games start?
Yeah, kick it off, Tor.
Okay. So when I was, I think, 11 or 12 years old, a friend of mine gave me a copy of the Mensa Red Box for D&D for Christmas. And I absolutely fell in love with it. I read that thing, not that it's very long, cover to cover several times, and everything starts there. I fell in love, started playing, and with maybe a brief hiatus here and there, I've been playing ever since. So everything starts with that red box.
Yeah, I think I didn't have that red box, but I think I know exactly which one you're talking about with that. Well, I was going to say that one with that beautiful art on the front, but they all kind of did that as well. So, and Luke, where did your love of role-playing games begin, or what's your path to?
Yeah, I was in Gaithersburg, Maryland one summer. My mother would banish me every summer to some relative, any relative that would take me to get rid of me. And so it's her brother and his family, her older brother. And the neighbors just, the neighbors had all the things I could not have. They had a Nintendo, they had a Nintendo or something, and they had Marvel Superheroes role playing, and that really, it really grabbed me. I collected a lot of comics at the time, and we started playing that summer. And I came home and talked to my friend and kind of fellow conspirator, Om Isabel, and he said, "Oh yeah, my brother, plays these games. Do you want to play?" And yeah, of course I wanted to play. And so he was the game master, a few blocks from my house. We played at his house, and we played Paranoia. We played Greg Kosikian's Paranoia. So it was a very rapid uptake. But like, as soon as I got home from that trip, I was already writing my own version of that RPG. We played D&D as well. They had Marvel Superheroes and Dungeons and Dragons and something else. They had a bunch of RPGs. And so I was immediately writing my own. I was playing a variety of games very quickly. And I was just captivated. It obviously has never let go of me since.
Yeah, and there seems to be this huge leap, at least for me mentally. Maybe it wasn't as much for you, but it seems to be a huge leap between being a player of games and suddenly now you two are top-level designers. I mean, Mouse Guard won, was it the 2009 Origin RPG of the Year? Not that you needed awards necessarily to let everybody know how freaking awesome these things are, but they are. And so, like, what was it that moved you guys from being players and doing homebrew stuff to designing these things and putting them out there?
I should probably start with this one. Since I kind of got tore into this. I mean, like I said, the first RPG I played, I was designing an RPG the next night, and in my RPG you could play gremlins and demons, and I immediately started making it better. But it took 20 years before I would really publish a game, and I just didn't realize that you could publish games. I didn't realize that you could even really do more than mess around and torment your friends with these games. I didn't yeah, I didn't realize that you could like design them and commission art for them and publish them. Like it just never hit me until, you know, much later in life. So, and then I just said, fuck it. I turned to my friends at the time, our friends Rich and Pete and Chris, and I said, hey, we've been playing this game for a while. Like, what do you say we publish it? And they were like, yeah, cool. And then, you know, a year and a half later of like designing and editing and playtesting, and they were like, fuck this sucks. Yeah, and so I kept going. I was like, fuck you, I'm gonna keep doing it. But yeah, and Tor enters the picture not too long after that.
Yeah, I had been running games and sort of homebrewing hacking games for my players for a long time. But yeah, I guess that was around 2004. I ran into Luke at a convention. I'd seen some stuff about Burning Wheel online before then in certain communities that we both frequented. But I made the mistake of telling him that I was an editor and that if he ever needed some help, I was available. And yeah, I've been trapped ever since.
2 weeks later, I would like to point out that I at least gave you a ride home.
You did. That was very kind of you.
Yeah, if a rumor gets out that you're an editor who's okay with taking on new projects, watch out. Like the flood is coming.
It is very true.
I've been telling, you know, my students of creative writing that they should really get into role-playing games if they want to really hone their storytelling skills, because you get immediate feedback from your players, whether or not you're telling a good story, or it gets you in the mind of characters. And so I really have seen role-playing games as a storytelling medium. At least I feel like it was a part of my training. But I hadn't really backed that up with actual gaming experience in so many years, not until I came around to Torchbearer and Mouseguard again. And the only reason I'm not also bringing up Burning Wheels because I just haven't had a chance to jump into that yet. But these things are, I think one of the things that you guys did to re-engineer it all is you really brought it back down to the storytelling level, not to trash D&D too much, but there is a tendency, I think, in not just my sessions I've had in Dungeons and Dragons, but others, in which it kind of defaults to these arbitrary rulings and kind of gaming the system. And by about 9th level, you're kind of like gods. Whereas Torchbearer and Mouseguard like bring it back down to something tangible, and it not only makes you want to adhere to the rules and it makes you want to make things hard on yourself as a player, but it pushes you into the actual role playing. And so I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on role playing as the storytelling medium and how you changed it. Change the rules in the system so that, you know, you're like tangibly rewarded for role-playing characters. I'm not even sure what that question is, except how did you come up with these brilliant ways of changing the game so you want to play your character with all these little quirks rather than just like having that as a topping to it?
It was just a simple design decision from the beginning, in that we tried to design for the way we played at the table. And so it was a matter of recognizing what was happening at the table, recognizing what was working at the table and what wasn't, and then designing mechanics to emphasize what we felt was working or to push things in that direction, and de-emphasize things that we felt weren't working. If we felt things that weren't working, not to de-emphasize them, but to re-architect them completely into a way that we felt would be more productive. So, but it really comes down to that core loop about making sure that we're designing for the way we're playing at the table.
Yeah, and I would add that we think a lot about feedback mechanisms, right? And how you get rewarded for doing things in play. So the corollary to what Luke is describing, I'm saying, you know, how do we get you to do things that might be suboptimal for your character? How do we get you to have your character behave in a suboptimal way? And part of that is providing feedback mechanisms that reward that. Right. So if you get your character into trouble because of some personality quirk, you actually get rewarded by your fellow players for making things more interesting. Right? And I think that's how we start to address some of that stuff.
Yeah, I had been previously thinking it was mostly conceptual, so it's really interesting to hear how important play testing is for that kind of, for evolving out the bad ideas and bringing forward the good ones. Because just yesterday I tried to run my own homebrew version of a 2-player mouse guard with no one running the game, no game master. And I thought it was brilliant, and then it was a complete disaster my first run through. And so it was just now hitting me how important running these things through live playtesting is.
Also, we design with a very different aesthetic. We're friends with Jeremy Crawford and Mike Merles at Wizards, and Rodney Thompson, who's worked on D&D 5e, and we talked to them about this stuff, and they're just under a different set of pressures and constraints for that game. They have to make a lot of people happy with D&D, and they have to kind of adhere to a very particular aesthetic that's kind of not too hard, not too soft. Whereas when we make a game, we have our idea of an aesthetic, and we don't care if you like it. We don't have to please anybody. We have our concept for this game, and we're gonna take that concept to the limit. We're going to try to make it a good game. We're going to try to make it enjoyable for us to play, but we're not concerned if anybody else likes it. So that's very beneficial for us in that we can continue to refine and focus down these ideas rather than having to worry about will our audience like this? Will there be uptake of this mechanic? There's very little of that discussion. Every so often we get to a place with a mechanic where it's just simply unworkable at the table. There's too much complexity, or there's too much of kind of brain bending where we just know that it's just simply not going to work for anybody at the table. But we're never thinking about if somebody going to like this or not. We're thinking about what's the experience that we want to design here.
Yeah, and your players seem to love that too. I mean, that seems to be connected to in some way with the crowdfunding kind of Kickstarter, that avenue for funding that allows you to kind of have that independent mindset. Although I'm not sure if that's true or not, so maybe I should phrase that as a question. Were you allowed to? Did that kind of independent crowdfunding source have an impact on how free you felt to do that kind of thing with your own games?
No. Funding's never a consideration. It's not. We're not rich. We don't have any money, but we'll produce a game with whatever means we have available.
I would add that we were doing sort of pre-sales before Kickstarter came around, before crowdfunding came around. Crowdfunding has made the process that we were already doing a lot easier, but it was the way we were doing things even before it was a thing.
Yeah, and I was at one point, my winding path to discovering your games was I came across this game on a video game called Darkest Dungeon. And then I read some articles of people saying they just ripped off Torchbearer, and Torchbearer is a re-engineering of Mouse Guard. And I got into it, and I'm like, by God, they did rip them off. I wonder if Luke and Thor are furious at Torchbearer. Until I found out that Luke, you're head of games at Kickstarter, and so you indeed probably helped out Darkest Dungeon quite a bit. Is that true?
I did. It's a great game. We're totally friendly with the Red Hook guys. We beat them to market with Torchbearer by a few months, I think. And we met them at PAX and we took them the book and we were like, dudes, check this out. And they were psyched. They were really happy about it. So yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there and kind of tangled history about Darkest Dungeon being based on Torchbearer, and that's just not true. And neither is Torchbearer based on Darkest Dungeon. It's just like it's the same deal as back in the day with Riddle of Steel and Burning Wheel. It's just two designers tackling similar problems, and going with.
Yeah, I think there was just something
designs.
in the air at that time. It was a parallel development. It was something in the zeitgeist.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's cool. And in this show, we haven't actually got into any of your monsters quite yet, even though it's essentially a monster show. But I'm sometimes curious when we zoom out a little bit. I'm like, why do we tell the kinds of stories that we tell, and why do we tell so many stories that involve monsters? And I think for the tabletop role-playing game, and I think that even applies to Mouse Guard, in which you are now like. You were scaled down so much that something like a blue jay presents a horrific threat to you and your family. That the monsters are everywhere. And so there's something about this focus on adventure in tabletop role-playing games, wanting to put players through an adventure that seems intimately tied to having to delve underground and encountering monsters. Why are we driven to putting ourselves underground and finding monsters in order to find that adventure?
Oh boy. I mean, there's something very compelling about titillating, right? About stepping into this liminal space, as Tor likes to say. This forbidden space, and being, with the idea that we can risk our avatars here, and we will, defy danger and be rewarded for it, both spiritually and materially. It's just, there's something very seductive about that. It's, it's kind of an ancient narrative.
Yeah.
But also the other side of it is that there's a much more violent side to it, and it's rooted in our culture's addiction to colonialism. And I mean, it's part of our foundational narrative, is that, we love to burst into places that we have decided are full of monsters, and destroy them, and kill them in their homes, and take from them what we please. It's pretty disturbing when you think about it in the historical context.
Yeah, and I think one game design that you kind of balance this messed up morality with is for both of those games, you make the characters like the underdogs in this world. And I think especially in Torchbearer, not only do your characters essentially have to be underdogs, but kind of like dirty outcasts as well. And I think it kind of makes it okay. Like you've got no choice but to hunt down monsters, because there's nothing else you can do in this world.
Yeah, I mean, your characters are villains in Torchbearer. You're outcasts that decide that they'd rather, pick up a sword than do anything else.
Right. I mean, it takes a crazy person to go out into those wilds, those monster-infested wilds, and try to make their living. And so that's why we present these characters as outcasts. If they were part of civilization, if they had a place, they would not choose to do these things.
Right.
Yeah, and that's and I like how you add this game mechanic of nature as well. Like it really benefits you to keep increasing, say, your nature rating. But if you get too deep into it, you're kind of set in your ways. You don't really want to adventure, and as in, like, you're now a normal human being, so you stop doing this crazy ass stuff. And I was so oddly fascinated by your description of human nature. Like, I guess philosophers have been trying to pin that down for thousands of years, and you guys came up with 3 gerunds essentially for human nature. What 3 gerunds, if you had to pick, for human nature? And you guys came down to running, demanding, and boasting, which is kind of interesting and maybe a bit pessimistic. I'm not quite sure. What was the thinking behind that in human nature? I'm curious.
Well, I think Tori, you came up with 2 of those, and I came up with 1. So you should start this off.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, I think it is a little pessimistic. There were a lot of discussions about this and how we approach it. I mean, obviously, there is potential to be really offensive when you're describing human nature. Running was actually pretty easy, right? I mean, that's the one thing that humans do better than most other animals.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of theory that we were able to run long distances to wear down our prey.
Yeah, can't we still outrun a horse at the 60-mile mark or something like that?
Yeah,
Like
I mean, horses can obviously run a lot faster than we can for some distance, but in the end, we can run them into the ground. Obviously, but if we're trained to do so. Go ahead, Luke. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Like, it's funny though. You say it was easiest, but I remember that was the last one we came to, because we had, I think we actually had another descriptor in there for a while, riding or something, because we were thinking of, like, we weren't thinking in terms of like this like real core ability. We were thinking in terms of like, what do we want? What do we want our adventurers to do? What culture are these adventurers from? And eventually, like as Thor said, we had to kind of take a step back and say, no, what's more core to not just adventurers or or this culture, but what's more core to like humanity, and we were like looked at each other, we're like, oh, running, and then but then we both, like, we said running, and then we both were like, oh, also it makes them cowards. It makes them both, like, running makes you a bully and a coward in this game, because you can run down other people, but you can also run away. So like it seems like it's this just this like physical athletic ability, but really it has a lot of moral force to it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, when I say easiest, I should really specify that I mean least controversial.
Yeah.
That one took a while, and when we look at Mittermark, we went back to some of those previous ideas. Right there is a human tribe in the Mittermark that has riding in place of running. There are a couple that have sailing in place of running. So some of those ideas did come back. But yeah, that was definitely the easiest one. And then Luke, I think your memory might be better than mine. Which one did you come up with?
I thought I was running and you were boasting and demanding.
Oh, okay. No, that may very well be.
Maybe you did all 3. I don't know. Maybe I'm taking credit I'm not owed.
You may very well have come up with that one, and it made perfect sense to me.
The boasting and demanding sounded like at the time I was reading that, I hadn't discovered the existence of Mittermark quite yet, and I was read boasting and demanding. I'm like, now this sounds like some people who like are fans of Saga of the Volsungs and Prose Edda or the Elder Edda too, because I'm a huge fan of them. And like and then when I found Mittermark, I'm like, oh yeah, these guys know Volsungs quite well. Yeah. And I liked how you like added to the whole boasting thing, that can amp. If you boast that you're about to do something, that really amps you up, but it ties you deeply to whether or not you accomplish that. But I'm not even sure if that had any influence on it or not.
You identified it precisely. I mean, those were the major influences. I think that we also can't escape Tolkien when we're dealing with fantasy. That is part of our DNA. And so, you think about the place of humanity there. I think boasting and demanding make perfect sense. Like you said, the poetic and prose Eddas, the Icelandic sagas. That's really where this stuff stems from.
Yeah, and to take that Tolkien branch a little bit, that can get us into the monsters for a minute, because I was so pleased when I finally got down to the monsters section in Torchbearer, in which it looks like you're finally going back to Tolkien. Like for instance, you don't just have the wights, the WIGHT as like in D&D. because white was what, essentially Old English for just like guy, dude, or something. There's nothing monstrous, but the barrow wights. I mean, when I read your descriptions of that, or even the red dragon, that's very Smaugrish, and in that, like, the red dragon's nature is what, devastating, outwitting, and hoarding, and like that's exactly right. Like, he wants to hoard and destroy just as much as he would like to, one up you in an argument. So I was curious, where you felt Tolkien coming into your monster design, and maybe a two-part question, like what was your filter through deciding on monsters, because you can't have 1,000 of them, and you want to do more than just a few. And so I'm curious how you decided on your monster selection.
Sure.
I think monsters are mostly you, Tor. No, the monsters are mostly you for Torchbearer.
So you're absolutely right that Tolkien is a huge part of that. Also, the Norse sagas and epics. I mean, I think that there is as much Fafnir in our Red Dragon as there is Smaug.
Yeah, that's true.
And this game obviously is an homage to what we love about D&D. So, that was a big part of the filter as well. What do we bring in to really give a flavor of that sort of red box experience? Not necessarily recreate, what that was, but give the players, the same sort of feeling that we had when we first encountered them. And so that was a big part of picking stuff like lizard folk and great wolves and great spiders and gnolls, all the sort of classic D&D monsters, but through our own filter.
Yeah, and Tor, you, if I'm recalling correctly, you were kind of further inspired by your grandmother telling you tales about trolls. Now, what kind of grandmother would do that to a poor kid?
Well, a Norwegian grandmother. My father's Norwegian. I spent quite a few years as a child living in Norway, my farmor, my grandmother, father's mother, was from Uppland, in a village called Hov, not far from Lillehammer. These stories were part of our DNA, right? I was hearing stories about the three billy goats gruff, and all of those Norse folk tales as a young child, it's stuck with me.
Yeah, and for these, and I think it's fascinating in a way that, I mean, a big part of what both of you guys are doing is essentially kind of recreating these stories that you get to live out as kids through games or otherwise, and being told this, and that's something I find pretty common among people I get to talk to in different fields, whether they're makeup artists in films or writers or game designers, as you guys are. That essentially a lot of what they do is just this like recreation of these things that mattered so much to them as children.
Yeah, absolutely. At the same time, I think that there is a danger in falling too much under the sway of nostalgia, right? So you want to you tap into this stuff from your childhood because it's powerful, but you don't want to do so necessarily unfiltered. Right? I think it's important for us to examine where we came from, the stories that are important to us, and try to understand them in a modern context.
Yeah, and back to those monsters in particular, the way you guys handle them. There's one feature you add in, and I think this first showed up in Mouse Guard, if I'm recalling correctly, Order of Might. And I think that's one of these like mechanisms that fix so many problems with other games that I've run across, which is no matter how tough you think you are, there's something a couple levels above, then there's just no way you could ever pull off a win against this kind of thing. And so the whole mechanism of Order of Might, I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit more about your thinking on that, how that came about.
Yeah, I'm more. I approach the games more from a systems design standpoint. So when we were kind of crushing down the like range of dice that we wanted to be used in Mouse Guard from Burning Wheel, and just kind of we're really simplifying and stripping out stuff. But there's a danger that in a die pool system like Mouse Guard that you're going to lose nuance. You're going to if you're just going to have like a range of dice from like 1 to 10 or 1 to 12 or something, that it's going to get very swingy, and that even if you're rolling 3 dice and you're rolling 12 dice, like a good roll and a bad roll can really upend believability. And so I was conscious of that. I was conscious of the comics, that I very much feel like the comics are a story about the scale of cosmic horror. I think that Mouse Guard is a game in the vein of like Cthulhu-esque cosmic horror. I
hadn't really thought about that Mouse Guard being like that, but you're right.
That was a big influence on us as we were working on this.
Huh.
Yeah, we were also trying to like fix Call of Cthulhu in a weird way. But so I was trying to think like how to better represent that, like instead of just piling on more dice or piling on more hit points or something else, instead of making something like kind of quantifiably attainable, how could I set threshold limits to make something essentially unattainable, and or at least like punishing, very 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 punishing. And so yeah, there's the Order of Might. Now it's funny, like I wanted the Order of Might because we needed some, like, really it comes down to like I needed some believability that like your Tenderpaw wasn't going to go toe to toe with a wolf day one and win, and or something like that, right? That there was some kind of believability to the scale of Animalia in the game. But of course, as soon as I set up this scale and Tor and I agreed that this was like the right direction to go, David immediately starts breaking all these rules in the comics. Like the comics, Liam and Kelenoff fight the owl, and then later in the Black Axe, Kelenoff is just chopping down foxes, and it's just like there's only so much I can do here, guys. Like, like this is where the game and the comics just slightly diverge from each other. But yeah, I just really needed that, like, to create a very believable, incredible scale. I think honestly it works even better in Torchbearer. I think that the Order of Might works great with dragons and gods and
and you have
giant stuff like that.
You have if I'm remembering correctly, in one of your images, you have a very Cthulhu-like image of like elder gods at the top level.
That's basically just an homage to our inspiration. There's a chart in the Call of Cthulhu, OG Call of Cthulhu, where they show you the scale of all the different creatures, and from human all the way to Cthulhu. And that was our inspiration for the whole like Order of Might system and mechanics. So that the Cthulhu Elder God monster is just a in-joke reference to that.
But one thing where I think that Mouse Guard really has it over Torchbearer is that it is incredibly easy for someone to imagine themselves as a mouse and think of like a moose in terms of the scale of that mouse, right? There's something visceral about that you can't quite capture, when you're thinking about a man or human versus a dragon.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about it. It's also one of the things that made my recent session become so much of a disaster, as I randomly rolled through the animal that we were going to have to encounter, and the first thing I came up with is a black bear. I'm like, oh my god, like we need a mouse army of 20,000 to even like annoy a black bear? Like, I'm a full grown dude and I couldn't handle a black bear.
Well, the wonderful thing about Mouse Guard in respect to that is that it encourages you to come up with some other way of interacting with that bear to solve the problem, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, and of these other game mechanics that you've kind of put together, like one of them is, I mean, they're like to me they're shockingly elegant, and one is this advancement. So much so, the way you have advancements built, even though in Torchbearer you do have levels, in some way you don't really need that as much because so much is focused on your abilities and skills advancing. And in order to advance, say your rank, say you have a rank 4 as a fighter, and then you want to advance that to 5, you would need to test that skill as many times and succeed as many times as your rank, but you also need to test it and fail almost as many times. And that is brilliant for a guy who likes trying skills and improving them and encountering failure so much as I do. I'm like, that nails what it actually takes to get good at anything. You've got to succeed a lot, but you have to fail almost as many times. It's just absolutely brilliant.
That comes to us from Burning Wheel, although it's a kind of a better evocation of it than what's in Burning Wheel, because Burning Wheel is just try, it doesn't matter if you succeed or fail, and even that was like kind of controversial at the time, but but it really just comes from my own experience, just failing at everything. And I'm still alive, and I might even be good at something. I don't know, but
yeah, you get better at it.
Fail a lot.
Yeah.
It's also a good example of what I was talking about earlier with regard to feedback mechanisms, right? I mean, this is a system that encourages players to not just try the things that they know they can succeed at. They have to strive and attempt things that are probably beyond them. And to us, that makes a good game.
Yeah, and it's something that I think anybody who has any interest in playing a game and kind of discovering what would it take for a game to kind of push itself along in the storytelling and make everyone want to engage in it as much as as any single individual at the table would, unlike, say, a game that's essentially pushed by a DM or a GM. I think once they encounter that, burningwheel.com and everything available there, I think that's gonna do it for them, because it's some fantastic stuff. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are with, say, Kickstarter or these crowdfundings for games. I recently had an indie filmmaker on the show who was talking about, how difficult it is for funding to even, get anything going Kickstarter for a film. He goes, what Kickstarter is really good for is games. And I'm like, I'm curious about that. And now that I have, say, head of games at Kickstarter, I'm kind of curious what you think makes or breaks a Kickstarter plan. And because I got a lot of people who listen to the show who are interested in making their own, starting up their own projects as well. So I know several of them are curious about, like, what if I want to make a game? Like, what's a, how big of an influence should success on Kickstarter be for me? And then what kinds of things might make or break that, do you think?
Well, you should never let the idea of like success on Kickstarter influence your game designs ever. You should make the game that's important to you, and make the game that speaks to you, or that maybe silences the voices in your heads. Like making a game to try to please others is just a path to madness. And then in terms of like games versus film, it's just that the games community is very active on the internet. The games community is an actual community, and that exist and talk to each other, and they hype games and creators, and whether it's on Kickstarter or off Kickstarter. So that it's just kind of like, it's just a phenomenon right now, and games, like games creators and games backers, understand that that it's kind of like they get Kickstarter. It's kind of like a game. It has a beginning, middle, and end. There's a goal. There's a time limit. Like there's surprises along the way. Like it just it just is something. It's just a process that is intuitively understandable to to games folks. So it just does make the process a lot easier if you're raising funds for a game as opposed to a film.
Yeah.
As someone who is not the head of games at Kickstarter but has participated in running several, my advice is don't expect Kickstarter to provide an audience for you. Right? You've got to build your own community and your own sort of audience of interest and bring it with you. Kickstarter can help amplify that, but you've got to do some legwork beforehand.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I like that. I mean, I think it's not too dissimilar from the kind of reality of, say, writing a book or something. Like if you're writing to be successful, your book's gonna suck. You really have to write the thing that, something that you're haunted with, and that that success doesn't necessarily make or break your decision to write, because that's the only real way you can get going. And it sure seems like this that game designing is a whole lot like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious for both of you, are there any dream projects for you that you haven't had the chance to get into yet? Any sort of, you've come up with some fantastic games already, and I know you're both quite busy with many other projects. That Luke at Kickstarter and Thor through, is it CIO.com? You're a senior writer, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you've got a bunch of stuff going on, but you've had a chance to put together some fantastic games. But are there any kind of dream projects you would love to work on one day that you haven't quite got to yet?
Play testing the new edition of Pendragon.
Oh, yeah.
That was my dream project.
I'd be down for that as well. Just started a Pendragon campaign, actually.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
I mean, I think that we've always been enamored of Earthsea. I don't know that a game could do it justice, but
sure.
I know Ursula and Kayla. I didn't know that there was a game based on.
No, there isn't. She's sadly gone now. But,
I thought. Okay, I mistakenly thought you were referencing an actual game that's already out there based on Earthsea. I'm like, I didn't know.
I mean, that would be a dream project. I don't know if it would ever happen. She was famously not interested in seeing her worlds gamified.
Yeah.
Yeah, her response was, "Get your own world."
And you guys have. Yeah. So I've got at least one more question for you both. It's the simplest one, but perhaps also the toughest one. If I had to pin you down, your favorite monster of all time, Luke and Thor, what would be your favorite monsters of all time?
Humans. Hands down.
I can't beat that one. 4 wins.
It wasn't a competition, guys, but I am talking to game designers, so I should have known better.
Well, if not humans, then John Gardner's Grendel is the greatest monster of all time.
That is a very good one.
It's the Beowulf tale told from the perspective of the monster, if you haven't read it.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. I started this whole podcast doing just transferring my monsters and literature lecture, and we darn near end with John Gardner's Grendel. Actually, I push it one step further to Mike Mignola's Hellboy, but in truth, I think I should probably have just stopped with John Gardner's Grendel because it's a thing of brilliance, that book.
Yeah, yeah. He yeah, just by turning the tables and showing humanizing the monster, but really just showing that the monster is trying to communicate, that it has its own culture, its own language. It doesn't also doesn't know its own strength, much like Beowulf doesn't know its own strength, and is simply trying to get along with these aggressive, angry, arrogant human beings, and everything goes wrong from there. I to me, obviously, I never considered that position until I read that story, which is, one of the great things, about good literature is that it presents, an idea so profound that it's obvious and it was kind of always there waiting to be discovered. But the Grendel, the monster ends up being far more human than Beowulf.
I think Luke has ended up giving the same answer that I gave.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we disagree.
Yeah, and you guys have kind of taken that mindset of thinking, and maybe this is, I didn't realize it until quite now. Maybe this is one thing that I'm so enamored with of your work is that you've really taken to seeing things from the monster's perspective as well, not only seeing adventurers, like taking a Dungeons and Dragons type of or dungeon delver type of adventurer seriously. These guys are kind of freakish monsters in society, but not only that, when you're into your monster design, whether it's the weasels in Mouse Guard who just love stealing stuff, or down to say some of the instincts you have for monsters and Torchbearer, like the goblin's instinct is to always lie, to always lie. Absolutely cracks me up. Like, so is that part of your game design too? When you're thinking of like monsters, like, wait a minute, what's life like from the eyes of this monster?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately every monster, most monsters, are reflections of our fears and our desires, our thoughts. Right? They are twisted and warped versions of ourselves, perhaps more true to ourselves than our own presentation. Right? So, I think that. That's why we think of monsters the way we do. Like, they are a representation of something human taken to an extreme.
I think that if we don't humanize monsters, so we don't give monsters character, wants, or needs, or culture, that then it is just a case of othering them, where it then becomes permissible to commit unmitigated violence, unreflected, unmitigated violence, and that's just not the story we want to tell. It's just not. It's not interesting. I don't think it's productive in a cultural sense. And it certainly doesn't reflect our values. So and Torchbearer is definitely like on the fence. Like, I think our Torchbearer monsters are a little one-dimensional. Like, but we made that decision. We wanted to try to compress them down rather than making them very like ultra nuanced like they are in Burning Wheel. There's a lot going on in Burning Wheel. So we were trying to compress them down, but looking back on it with the distance of 5 or 6 years now, I think that we maybe took too many of their human qualities out, and made it a little too easy to just point to them and say monster, rather than looking at them saying like, oh shit, this is an intelligent alien creature that I have to deal with in some way that I'm not accustomed to. And if I do this right, then it's going to be good for everybody. If I fuck this up, then it's going to be bad for everybody. So So it's tough. It's just tough to strike that balance. But we never design our monsters with the intent that they're just blood bags to be slashed with swords. We're always looking at them in a way that how can we evoke these contradictions for the players? How can we put the players in the position of making moral decisions about their actions?
Yeah, and you seem to have kind of built that into the game mechanics as well, too, in that, unlike a lot of other role-playing games that I know of, that as soon as you encounter an obstacle or say a monster in other games, you have the choice of like killing it or running away, and your conflict management system is essentially like you could try arguing with it, you can try talking with it, you could try just to chase it off or scare the thing off, and you do a lot of warning about how dangerous it is to go in for the kill on something, because then aren't you gonna spur the monster into wanting to kill you back? If all you want to do is scare it off, maybe it'll get scared off or stand its ground, but you're still a lot better off than deciding, oh, I'm just gonna hack and slash. And so I think it's another elegant thing that adds complexity really to all the games that you guys put together, is that there's more to conflict than just killing or not killing. There's so many different paths to dealing with monsters.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Luke.
I was just going to say that if we have this sentiment that I just expressed and we don't give you tools to address it in a different way, then we've failed as designers.
I was just going to say that this is actually one of my favorite features of both Mouse Guard and Torchbearer, is that the players have to make a very conscious decision to kill. Right? You don't do it by accident, and you are very conscious of the fact that you are putting yourself at serious risk if you do so, and so you are encouraged via the rules, not mandated, but encouraged to find another way through, to find something that doesn't necessarily involve violence and death. And I love that.
Yeah, and I've been bragging on the brilliance of the game mechanics and how you guys handled it both in Mouse Guard and Torchbearer. Again, I haven't mentioned, by the way, that the prose is solid, man. The actual descriptions and the setting up of the game world, Mousebearer in Mousebearer in Mouse Guard, in Torchbearer, in Mittermark, is that I'm a little bit picky. I'm not a snob about the prose in a game, but I mean but it's like the prose is solid. Like it's just a fun read as it is. I know that's not reading through a game manual isn't the same as playing it. You got to play these things for them to come to life. But with that said, the prose is really solid. It's fantastic stuff.
Well, thank you. We work really hard to be both evocative and clear at the same time. And, technical writing for games is hard. It's because really we're giving you like really shitty stereo instructions. Put tab A into port B, maybe sometimes. So yeah, we also have to evoke the setting and the feel of the game. So it takes a long time. It's hard.
Yeah, and you guys have a lot of inside jokes and references. I think one of the hardest factor in using a scholar skill, I think, is like writing role playing games or something like that.
Yeah. Well, we gotta keep ourselves amused as we're as we're writing.
There's a certain madness that creeps in at some point during the process.
Well, are there any current projects that you have going on that you would like to share or promote or drum up support for?
No, I'm good.
You don't want to mention Miseries and Misfortunes?
No, it's a crazy game. It's a crazy game for crazy people. I'm
crazy. I'm curious.
Fewer people should play that. I did a Kickstarter for a hack of basic D&D that allows you to play in the year 1648 in Paris. and I did it, and it works. But as you might imagine, it's a little esoteric.
I don't know. I've got to check that out now. I'm curious.
I'm in the process of finishing up an adventure for Torchbearer that we kickstarted back in March. And I'm probably a little behind schedule at this point. But it's called The Bridge of the Damned. And I hope to have that finished up very soon.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to have links to not only to these products on Burning Wheel, but if you want, I can also in the description of this episode throw in links to anything else you want, including any of those Kickstarter campaigns as well. But it's been a real pleasure to get to talk with both of you, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh.
So thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on The Monster Professor.
Our pleasure. That was good.
Yeah, thanks for having us.